So, good morning. How many do we have on, Michelle? Can you?
We currently have 34 people signed up right now, and we
Okay.
had 58 register. So I think we might have a couple people joining.
Okay, awesome. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being a part of this webinar today, and for the Fire Marshal hosting this for us. We want to share with you a few things. So I'm going to start out with the new grant that we are providing for firefighters starting this fiscal year, which began July 1. It is a Firefighter Exposure to Environmental Elements Grant Program. It is part of the Safety Intervention Grant Programming. You might be familiar with that program. It began many years ago, back in 1999, and we continue to provide funding to Ohio employers to help them eliminate risk of injury and illness through the purchase of equipment that would intervene and reduce the risk of exposure. So we have, we began this new program to help minimize firefighter exposure to dangerous environmental elements, which could eventually lead to cancer. And this program is part of the SIG program. Like I said, there is funding for this program for fiscal year 18, which just began, and fiscal year 19, which begins the next July 1 in 2018. Each of these fiscal years, we have set aside $2 million of the $15 million that we have allocated for the Safety Intervention Grant Fund. We've set aside the $2 million specifically for this particular grant. The maximum amount that an employer can receive through this grant program is $15,000. That is for the life of the program. So if you're an employer and you receive $15,000 this fiscal year, you will not be able to apply for $15,000 again in the next fiscal year. Now, employers who have less than $500,000 in payroll, there will not be a match for this grant, so we will provide the funds directly with no match. For employers with over $500,000 in payroll, it's a 5-to-1 match. So with that said, for example, if an employer has has payroll over $500,000 and they have a project that is, they want to purchase items that total $18,000, we would provide $15,000 and they'd be responsible for the other $3,000. As far as what qualifies for this grant, there are only 4 items that we allow with this particular program, and that is the diesel exhaust systems, extractors, washing machines for turnout gear, hoods with barrier protection, and washable gloves. So only those 4 items can be applied for. If something else is applied for, the grant application will be returned. Also, we do not allow the grant funds to be used to purchase the detergent, laundry detergent for the washing machines. As far as the eligibility, this grant is open to state-funded private and public firefighter employers. You must have active BWC coverage and maintain that coverage over the time that you're participating in this program. And we'll get to that in a minute. Also, you cannot have more than 40 cumulative days of lapsed coverage within the last 12 months. You must have been in existence for 2 years, reported payroll to BWC, at least 1 full policy year of payroll. And lastly, you must have provided a timely true-up report in the last true-up period. Now, for public employers, the payroll period is a calendar year. For private employers, it's our fiscal year. So the true-up period for this year, I believe, ends in mid-September, or somewhere abouts like that, like as they did last year. We've had this asked quite a bit, so I wanted to make sure it's clear that employers who participate in the Safety Intervention Grant Program and currently have a grant and they're in their 2 years of participation, they are also eligible to apply for the firefighter grant. The only caveat here is that if you are in the SIG program and you want to apply for the firefighter grant, you must be current on your quarterly reporting and submission of receipt documentation for the SIG program before we would process a new application. Also, we want to make sure that you're aware that a few of the items that are available through the firefighter grant program may also be applied for through the SIG program. And that would be the diesel exhaust systems and the extractors, the washing machines for turnout gear. One of the major differences is, though, between the two programs, if you do apply for one of these items through the SIG program, it is a 3-to-1 match. So you would be providing a larger part of the cost of the equipment. But we want to make sure that you know that's available. If you have not received SIG funds and you are thinking about applying, you could do that and then apply for one of the other items through the firefighter grant. So just want to make sure you are aware of that. Also, if you wonder if you want some further assistance with this, you could always contact one of our service offices and talk with one of our safety consultants, and they'd be glad to help you determine what might best work for you as far as providing funds for this equipment. So there's several areas that we find some of the fire departments are having some difficulty with the application. And I just want to make sure that you're aware of those areas and that if it's completed correctly and we get everything in that we need, it can be a smooth process. But as it is now, we've been receiving so many applications that we have issues with that this is really a timely webinar, so we can make sure and share with you what we're seeing. So we have, there is an application you're going to download from our website. This application has several questions. It's relatively short compared to the Safety Intervention Grant application. It's also going to include budget pages and an agreement. And some of what we're seeing is that the budget page may not have a date on it, and the agreement as well. And it might even be signed by someone who really doesn't have the fiduciary responsibility to be signing the agreement or the budget page. Now, there's a lot of definitions for fiduciary. I understand that. But one of them I like the best is that this individual with fiduciary responsibility is a person in position of authority who may act on behalf of the employer to meet certain obligations, and also will care for the money or the property. So we do ask that you make sure someone in that position signs the agreement and the budget page. Also, we have a few places on the agreement which require initials, which we don't always see completed, and once again, it's going to hold up the process. This is what that page looks like, and I know it's really busy, but I want to draw your attention to these two boxes that say require your initials. So those should be read and initialed, and then the individual with that authority should sign this document. Now, when you submit your application, you're required to submit a budget page, which is a budget table of all the items you're going to purchase and the exact cost. And this is another area where we're finding we have some concern with. First off, I want to make it clear that there can be no prior purchases. So if you have purchased equipment and now you're applying for a grant, you won't receive the funds for it. Also, if you apply and then move forward and purchase it before you get the check, you would be deemed ineligible and you won't receive the funds. So all items that you want to purchase must be listed on the budget page. The quote amounts must match the budget page. So we're asking for specifically a price quote. This quote cannot be a sales agreement, a purchase agreement, an invoice, any of those items that are used as a quote. It must say it's a price quote. This is one of the controls we have in place for this program, as well as the Safety Intervention Grant Program. Otherwise, these other documents would appear that you might have made that purchase already, and we won't be able to process the application. On the price quote, we want to make sure that the equipment vendor name and address is on the price quote. We want to make sure that the contact name and information and telephone number is on there. In the event that for some reason our relationship isn't with the vendor, equipment vendor, it's with you, but if for some reason we have a concern or a question and we need to contact the equipment vendor, we want to have a name and a telephone number to do so. Also on that quote, it must be specifically for your fire department, so we want to see your fire department name and address on there, and also we need to have the quote dated. Okay. The next two slides, once again, these are pretty busy, but I just wanted to show you what the budget pages look like. This particular budget page is for employers who have less than $500,000 in payroll, and there will not be any match required. So down there along the right side at the bottom, it says amount requested from BWC. We will have you complete there the amount you're requesting from us. That's for employers with payroll less than $500,000. Employers with payroll greater than $500,000 will have the match, and so we have a section here in the middle of the screen. You can see where you can calculate the amount that you would be providing and that you're asking BWC to provide. Also under step 2 there's a few questions about ownership or affiliation with the vendor of the equipment, and those are questions you're required to answer for us. And this budget page also requires a signature of somebody with authority with the employer. So in order to receive funds from the state of Ohio, you must have obtained a supplier ID number through the Ohio Shared Services Agency. There are links on our webpage to the W-9 and the electronic fund transfer form that are also required by OSS. Those links are on the grant webpage. We ask that you complete those and send them to Ohio Shared Services. We do not want to receive that information. That's not information for our eyes. That's for Ohio Shared Services. So the information on where to mail that is on our webpage, and it's also on those forms. In order to obtain a supplier ID number, you need to go to our grant webpage and click on the link to Ohio Shared Services we provide there, and it is actually a web page where you complete information to obtain your supplier ID number. Now, I imagine most of the larger public employers have a supplier ID number, so all this information may not be needed, but I would recommend that you call Ohio Shared Services and ask them before you make an assumption that you don't have to complete any of this. It's better to have this done up front than to wait till we're ready to pay you and we can't pay you out because we don't have the information. And we see the supplier ID number through the OAK system, the payment system that we use. So we know whether you have obtained it or not through that. So to apply for the grant, please read all sections of the web page before applying for the grant. Not only the firefighter grant web page, there's also a link from that page to the SIG application, because on the firefighter grant page there's information that's just specific to that particular grant that's a little different than the other program, but you are required to meet a lot of the requirements that are under the SIG program as well, which most of them I'll be bringing up here. I already have talked about and I will talk about. So anyway, read each section on the web page, both web pages, answer all the questions on the application. And if the question doesn't apply or it's a 0 or whatever, maybe it'd be best if you explained why you wouldn't be completing that question. On the budget page, I mentioned there were a few questions about ownership and partnership with affiliation with a vendor. There's also a question on there regarding whether you will be taking out a loan for your portion of the grant if you are if you do have to have a matching grant. And we need to know if you are taking that loan out, if you're going to obtain a loan agreement, because we will need a copy of that. We don't see too many of those coming in for the firefighter grant. That's mainly for the SIG grant where there's a larger amount of money involved. Make sure you initial the agreement page in the 2 places, mail all these documents in, and keep a copy for yourself. And then also, as far as the timeline goes, we've received well over 150 firefighter grants, and then of course we have the regular SIG grants that are coming in. So to process all of these, the turnaround time it's taking a bit longer than we would normally take for grants. I would say you should hear that yours is going to be reviewed within 4 to 6 weeks of our receiving it, perhaps maybe 7 weeks. And then once it's reviewed and approved, the payment doesn't take as long. You should probably receive payment within 4 weeks of that time. But we're trying to speed that timeline up. That is just to give you an idea, worst case, what might happen.
Hey, Carol.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Somebody had a question. So
okay.
The application that they downloaded only has one place where initials are required, not 2 shown in the presentation. So I'm just wondered, was there a different application that may have been available at one time and it changed, or maybe you can send me the current application, I can get it out to everyone.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I forgot to mention that we just recently added all of that. The reason why we added the second initial box is this will prevent us from reaching out to the employer again, as we have been doing when we see someone like the assistant fire chief or a clerk maybe signing. We would reach out and ask them, so we have an email documentation with them responding saying, yes, we have a fiduciary responsibility or authority to sign this. Now we're just going to have that initial. So it should be out on the website soon, but go ahead and use what you have, and that's fine. We just recently made that change.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Next steps after the award. Once you receive the grant funds, you have 90 days. Let's see if I can move this ahead there. 90 days from the date of the grant check spend the money and get everything in place. If you need more time than that, we ask you to email us to our mailbox, and I'll give you that information, and let us know that you're going to need more time, and we'll extend that time. By the way, once you receive that grant award too, you will, within a week or two of that grant award, you'll receive a letter from us giving you some of these deadline dates. We will let you know that 90-day period past the grant award, and then also we will provide you with a date that's 120 days past the grant award and what's expected then. And that is by 4 months after, or 120 days, we expect to receive the receipt documentation. And what we ask for is a copy of the approved budget page, the itemized invoices, and they should, well, actually, they must show that it's been paid in full, either stamped or typed paid in full. We need proof also if you're a matching employer. The receipt documentation must include the portion that you're paying as well. Copies of all the bank cleared checks or your online statement, front and back of those checks. And once we receive all that, we will bill you for return of any unused funds. If the purchase ends up coming under the amount that that the quote originally showed, then we will bill for return of those funds. At the end of the year, 1 year after you've made your purchase, we will ask you to complete a year-end case study. That case study will just ask questions regarding what, how the equipment worked for you, how well everything went, how you felt about the program, and so forth. And right now, the link is not out there. It's not available yet. We are still working on that. But once again, that's at 1 year after you've made your purchase and started using the equipment. So if you need to contact us, we have a mailbox designated to the safety grant program, and then you can always call the 800 number. And then also I've provided the our mailing address here, and I think that's it. The only thing I didn't provide there was the web page. I apologize for that. So,
hey, Carol, I think I'll go through and show the web page at the end of mine. How's that?
Yeah, that'll work. Thanks, Glenn.
Okay. Yep.
Okay, I'm going to switch it over to Glenn now.
Yes.
All right. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I wanted to, I don't know if, let me collapse this. Wanted to, before we get off the grants and we get into the introduction to PERRP, I wanted to briefly touch on a couple things that have come up with the grants that I think are important. One question that just came up recently was if you have what's known as a minimum policy that only just collects the main fees to maintain a policy number, and you'll know that if you only pay about $120 a year. You don't actually have a policy, and Carol may want to touch on that. Maybe she knows a little bit more about that. But if you don't actually have a policy, then you're not eligible for the grants. And that's an important thing because we have had a couple departments that have wanted to apply that don't have an official policy with BWC. Another question that's come up is the concept of washable gloves. And the answer to the question is, what is a washable glove? It's any structural firefighting glove that meets the requirements of NFPA 1971. So if the glove that you are looking at is a liner, a disposable liner, a supplementary glove for vehicle extractions or for some other purpose, those gloves are not eligible under the grant. Because people said, well, they're washable, but they're only hand washable. It doesn't matter if it's washable, it's washable. hand wash or machine wash, and not very many are machine wash, or they're not recommended for machine washing. But we're looking at something that you can purchase for structural firefighting. Third question that's come up recently with the grants is diesel exhaust systems. And the diesel exhaust systems that are going to be eligible under the grant program are going to be those systems that capture at the source. So it's going to be a hose system that's going to connect to the tailpipe. If you do have some apparatus that has exhaust that vents upward, has an exhaust pipe that points to the ceiling, then there are some exhaust systems where you can back the apparatus into the system and it will collect it at the ceiling. But not very many pieces of apparatus have exhaust that goes upward. But if you do, that's the type of system that we would pay for. So those are some basic grant questions that have come up just recently in the last couple weeks. So on to a brief introduction here of PERRP, Ohio PERRP. Ohio PERRP is very similar to federal OSHA. So a lot of people have heard of OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, but the Public Employment Risk Reduction Program is different. However, both agencies have some responsibility for worker safety and health protection. The difference is a jurisdictional issue. Federal OSHA has jurisdiction over the private sector, whereas PERRP has jurisdiction over public employers. And I know that there are a handful of true private companies, fire companies here in Ohio. And if you are a true private fire company, it's likely that you're going to fall under federal OSHA's jurisdiction. But if you are a publicly funded and publicly operated, even if you are a fire district and you operate as a nonprofit, it's likely that you're going to be under PERRP jurisdiction. And that's important because in PERRP history, one of the things that happened originally is back in 1970, when federal OSHA was created, everyone that works for the government was excluded from their jurisdictional authority, and that actually applies still today. No one that works for a government agency falls under federal OSHA enforcement jurisdiction. 1973 is when the program here in Ohio got its start, and that came through a governor's executive order that required all state agencies at that time to comply with the newly developed federal occupational safety and health standards. And then in 1992, the jurisdiction was expanded to include not just state agencies, but all local jurisdictions. When that happened, however, a carve-out was created for police and for fire. And 2017, the carve-out for fire departments went away, and there was partly some confusion back around 2000 where we were given jurisdiction over fire departments for the purposes of bloodborne pathogens. So now we have full jurisdiction over fire service, occupational safety and health issues. The purpose of PERRP is multifaceted. We help employers by identifying workplace hazards. We do have mandatory job safety and health standards. We also have a separate injury and illness record-keeping system. You may have heard about a lot of the record-keeping changes for the private sector for federal OSHA. Those changes don't apply to PERRP. One of them, PERRP has actually had in place since 2003, and that's an online reporting requirement for all public employers to report to us their annual injury and illness statistics. So we've had that in place now for 14 years, and federal OSHA is just now catching up with something that we've had in place for quite some time. We also spend a lot of time, 50 to 60% of our time is spent on providing compliance assistance services. So we get out there and try to work proactively with employers to provide them with training. We do voluntary risk reduction walkthroughs, and we hope through that entire process that you gain a better understanding of the regulations that apply to your particular work operations. The Act, the PERRP Act, or the Public Employment Risk Reduction Act, establishes two basic employer and employee responsibilities. The first one is that every public employer is required to provide a workplace free from recognized hazards, and that's known as the General Duty Clause. Going along with that, we also have a requirement for public employees that they comply with all safety and health regulations and any reasonable safety and health policies that you develop to make sure that you're in compliance with adopted regulations. So public employers and public employees have to make sure their workplace is safe. They have to comply with any adopted standards, and where necessary and appropriate, public employers are expected to implement policies and procedures to ensure the safety of their employees. We kind of look at compliance and complying with these regulations as a starting point. Look at that as the foundation. So we want to make sure that you're meeting what we consider to be the minimum requirements to provide a safe and healthful workplace for your employees. That's not the ending point. Just like a house, you know, start and end with a foundation. We want you to build on that, but we have to make sure that you have a good foundation in place initially so that you can build on that and you can develop a good exemplary safety and health program. So what is it that we enforce when we're coming through and we're doing walkthroughs of workplaces? Well, what we've done is we've gone through a process called incorporation by reference. So the federal OSHA regulations specifically have three parts: Part 1910, Part 1926, and Part 1928. Those sections or parts of the OSHA regulations we have incorporated by reference, and they are now Ohio law, and all public employers are required to comply with everything that we have adopted. We also have some sections in the Ohio Administrative Code and Ohio Revised Code in chapters 4167 of both of those. So the General Duty Clause that I referred to earlier is 4167-04A1, and I'm going to touch more on that because it's a really important concept for fire departments. We also have a separate requirement for a workplace safety poster that must be posted, and I've got a slide on that. We have an injury and illness record-keeping system that has separate rules. Again, I mentioned that the federal OSHA record-keeping rules and the changes to those rules that were recently announced for the private sector do not apply for public employers here in Ohio. You're required to comply with our injury and illness record-keeping rules and follow the instructions that we have. We also require the Ohio Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices to be applied whenever you're working in or near a roadway, or what's known as the right-of-way of a roadway. And that question comes up quite a bit with fire and police. Your turnout gear needs to have appropriate high visibility elements applied to it. Your vehicle should have high visibility elements applied to it. Where necessary, setting up signs if you've got an incident scene that's going on, that will be going on for quite some time, setting up some sort of advanced warning for motorists so that they don't run into your vehicles while you're out there. You hope that the lights will be visible to them, but that's not always a given. We've had several unfortunate incidents with people driving into emergency vehicles, either stopped in the roadway or alongside the roadway, or striking public safety workers. So we want to make sure that you're applying all of the appropriate elements of that manual to keep yourselves and your workers visible while they're out there on roadways. Although this is not, I can't think of any instances when it would apply. We don't enforce the federal OSHA radiation standards. We actually enforce the NRC standards, which are in 10 CFR 20. I mentioned the poster. If you have the poster on the right or something that looks like that up in your station house, that poster needs to come down and it needs to be replaced with the poster on the left, which is the Public Employment Risk Reduction Program poster. You can call us and we'll send you a copy of that poster. You can actually download it and print a copy. We ask that you print it in legal size because it is a fairly large poster, and if you print it any smaller than that, the wording is going to be too small for most people to be able to read. So if you need copies, let us know, and we can be more than happy to provide those to you free of charge. The general duty clause, I want to make sure I cover this because it is a really important concept. The federal OSHA regulations, if you've not had a chance to look at them in the recent past, don't have a lot of information in it that you were going to say, well, this applies to the fire service. Some of the regulations that we're going to be looking at that are OSHA regulations that will definitely apply would be things like the respiratory protection program. We're going to expect fire departments to implement a good respiratory protection program for their staff, and that is going to include some sort of medical examination as part of that respiratory protection usage. The hazard communication program that deals with hazardous chemicals in the workplace, we'll be expecting departments to comply with that. The Hazardous Waste and Emergency Operations Standards 1910-120 is also going to be enforced by us, so we'll be expecting departments to be in compliance with that. And then there are provisions, for example, in trenching excavation for some rescue operations, and also confined space. Rescue provisions in the OSHA confined space in 1910-146. So we're going to be looking at the OSHA standards that apply specifically, and then if we don't have a specific standard that applies, we may need to be resorting to the general duty clause. The general duty clause goes back to the concept of every employer is required to provide a workplace that's free from recognized hazards. We're only allowed to use the general duty clause if it involves a recognized serious hazard. And I think everyone would agree that most of what the fire service does is extremely serious and poses a lot of serious risks. So there are going to be a lot of times that we're going to be able to apply the general duty clause for the fire service when we would not be able to apply it in other circumstances for other employers. We cannot impose a stricter requirement through the general duty clause than an adopted standard would require. So for example, in the OSHA Respiratory Protection Standard in 1910-134, it sets out some minimum requirements for medical evaluations. That's the standard that we're going to hold departments to, is the section that is covered in 1910-134. We won't be applying any stricter requirements from any outside consensus standards, for example, NFPA standards. But I'll talk about how NFPA standards are going to impact you. The general duty clause also can't be used to enforce a should standard. And if you're familiar with consensus standards or with OSHA standards, you know that there are some key words that should pop out at you. Should, shall, must, and may are the four key words. Shall and must indicate mandatory provisions. If an adopted standard or a consensus standard says shall or must, then we can enforce the general duty clause, and we can require the employer to use those protective measures, whatever they are, to ensure the safety and health of the employees that they have. If it says should or may, how I want people to think about should or may is, yes, it's a voluntary provision. However, many times, particularly in NFPA standards, the concept of shall or may is used to indicate that there's more than one right way to accomplish whatever the protective measure is. It's the obligation of the employer to identify the best method. So instead of saying here is the only right way, look at should and mays as there's a continuum of possibilities for providing protection for employees. It's your obligation to make sure that you pick something along that continuum. If you pick nothing, then you're at risk of being in violation of the general duty clause. Picking something is an option, picking nothing is not an option. So we want to make sure that when you're reading through standards that you're trying to address them and apply them. The nice thing about a consensus standard is it does give you some latitude and some ability. Many of them are written as performance-oriented standards or rules. A performance-oriented standard is much different than a specification standard. A specification standard really does only tell you that there's one right way to do it, and it's the way that's prescribed in the standard or rule. The performance-oriented approach means here's an objective that we want you to achieve. And it's your obligation to decide what the best way is to maneuver yourself toward that end objective. What is it going to take? What administrative controls are going to be necessary? What engineering controls are going to be necessary? What personal protective equipment is going to be necessary? So you look at the continuum and the hierarchy of controls to make sure that you're making the best decision for each circumstance that pops up in your particular workplace. So OSHA and PERRP, we promulgate and enforce mandatory safety and health standards. ANSI, the American National Standards Institute, is a private nonprofit organization that promotes voluntary compliance or the adoption and the creation of voluntary compliance standards known as consensus standards. And the ANSI process kind of safeguards the integrity of the consensus process. NFPA standards are developed through an ANSI-approved consensus process. There are some examples that I want everybody to think about in terms of what would PERRP look at and what might they apply the general duty clause for. Here are some examples. NFPA 1500, the most current edition, just recently came out. In fact, it just came out today, I believe. The 2018 edition came out September 1st. So NFPA 1500, the standard for occupational safety and health wellness programs in fire departments. 1971, I mentioned earlier when I was talking about the washable gloves. All of your gear needs to be used and maintained and serviced and replaced according to the requirements that are in 1971, or you have to come up with an equivalent measure to maintain that. 1851 talks more about the selection, care, and maintenance of those ensembles. So you want to make sure that you're looking at that standard. That standard is what we looked at when we were deciding, for example, what type of washing machine extractors would be appropriate for the firefighter exposure to environmental elements grant. So we looked at the provisions that were in 1851. We looked at what the specifications were for a washing machine extractor. For example, it must have variable speed for the spin cycle. If it doesn't have variable speed, then it's not going to meet the requirements of 1851. It's strongly discouraged that you use a top-loading machine that has an agitator. Top-loading machines in general are not going to work nearly as well as a front-loading machine. So we want to make sure that you're making the best decision for purchasing that gear and that washing machine extractor unit. 1911 deals with inspection, maintenance, and testing of your vehicles and your apparatus. So we want to make sure that you developed a good program for regularly inspecting and maintaining your equipment. When would we come out and why would we come out? Well, we have basically 5 priorities, or we will have 5 priorities shortly after the first of the year. Our first priority is a refusal to work, and questions have come up about how that's going to apply to the fire service. And the basic idea behind the refusal to do work is not that there's just an imminent danger, because a lot of the work activities that the fire service performs definitely provide a possibility of an imminent danger. The obligation is that the employer place a process into place that will ensure that when employees are engaged in those imminent danger operations, they've got adequate training, they've got adequate equipment, and that equipment is adequately maintained. So as long as all of those things are in place and we have the operations designed in a way that minimizes the risk of that imminent danger, then we do not have a valid refusal to work. So the only way we would have a valid refusal to work is if you were basically doing nothing to ensure the safety. And that's not likely, but we want to make sure that you're doing everything that you possibly can to ensure the safety during those imminent danger situations. If you have a fatality or a hospitalization incident, you're going to have to report that to PERRP within 8 hours. We start our inspection program as soon as we possibly can whenever we have a public employee fatality, so that's why we have the 8-hour reporting time frame. Complaints are a little bit different than a refusal to do work situation. A refusal to do work is that we've got a situation that's occurring right now with a high-risk situation. In the complaint, we can have an employee that is going to file a complaint because, in general, they believe that all of the things are not in place to ensure compliance with adopted standards. So they can file the complaint. When a complaint is filed, we have a different process for that, where we provide 30 days for the employer to investigate the nature of the complaint, to implement corrective action, and then respond to us about what they did to ensure the safety of their employees. And we could have circumstances where it's an invalid complaint, and you can respond to us that through your investigation you've determined that the allegations were unfounded. That's certainly a possibility, but you need to provide us with documentation that that was the outcome of your internal investigation. And all of that, again, has to happen within 30 days. If it doesn't happen within 30 days and we do not hear a response from you, then we will initiate an investigation over the complaint issues. Beginning next year, we will, in spring of 2018, have a general schedule inspection process, and that inspection schedule is going to be based upon high-risk workplaces and work tasks. Our primary focus initially with most public employers in this process is going to be things like trenching and excavation, confined space, roadway work zones. The fire service, we want you to take part in what really is our 5th priority in terms of, if all things happen at the same time, our compliance assistance inspections. We want to encourage you to ask for our assistance ahead of time. Every employer has a right to a voluntary risk reduction walkthrough. Now, our voluntary risk reduction walkthroughs are a lot different than anything else that you can get from any other outside source. They are protected by law, so if you request us to walk through your facility, we're not allowed, and no one else is allowed to use any of the information that we've gathered during that inspection in any court proceeding in the state of Ohio for a period of 3 years. No one else can provide you or any other public employer with that assurance that what we've identified, we're going to give you sufficient time to take corrective action on it. So we want to encourage you to do that, and we spend more than half of our time going out and working proactively with employers on compliance assistance. Fatalities, I mentioned this already, but make sure that you report these and put policies in place to notify us within 8 hours. You have to report them verbally to us, so you have to call our 1-800 number, 1-800-671-6858, and press option 1, and we will get back to you as soon as we possibly can about that notification. If we're available right when you call, we'll pick up that line, and that could be 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That phone line is always monitored. Compliance assistance, what does that mean? Well, you can request, as I said, compliance assistance. That does demonstrate a good faith effort towards compliance, which is why the legislature gave us the ability to give you 3 years to take corrective action. They know you're asking out of good faith. We want to give you the time to come into compliance. So we're offering a lot of services. We will do safety walkthroughs. We will do health surveys. We'll come in and do diesel exhaust monitoring for you, for example. We'll come in and look at your bloodborne pathogens program to make sure that it is up to snuff and we've got everything covered. We'll do training. Right now, our focus for fire departments is to make sure that we provide a basic introduction to PERRP for fire departments. So if you're interested in doing a basic introduction to PERRP, a little bit longer version of the presentation that I'm doing today, then invite us in and give us a call at that 1-800 number. If you do have us walk through, we will give you a very detailed voluntary inspection report, which will have target dates for you to meet. We'll reference the standard that's appropriate. We'll explain to you what the violation was and where we identified it. We'll tell you how it can potentially impact the occupational safety and health of your employees, and we'll provide you with some recommendations on how you can address those risk factors in your workplace. And then we ask that you provide us with a corrective action report. So those compliance assistance findings are voluntarily abated. We'll send you a corrective action report following the inspection. You'll send it back to us and we'll log into our system, and that helps us tell the governor every year that voluntary compliance works. So we're emphasizing the fact that we want this program out there for people. We want them to participate in it, and we know that it works because they're telling us that they're correcting the things that we find during our visits. So how do you get our services? Well, you can call us at 1-800-671-6858, or you can visit bwc.ohio.gov. So I wanted to pull up the BWC website for you. And if you are on the main BWC webpage, if you click on Safety Services, just the orange part here that says Safety Services, that will take you to the main DSH page. And to show you, first of all, where the grant information is, if you click here on Safety Grants, and then in the Safety Grant page, the grant for firefighters and social workers, which is another new grant that we have, is right here. So this will take you to the Firefighter Exposure to Environmental Elements Grant Program, and this explains everything that the grant program will pay for, the steps to complete your application, how to complete the application and processing it, and then the next steps. So this goes through the entire process and includes links to the actual application. Over here on the left-hand side, whenever you're in the DSH end of the BWC workplace or work website, you'll see over here PERRP. You can click on that, and that will take you to the Public Employment Risk Reduction Program web pages. The PERRP homepage has got some basic information about who we are, what we do, the elements of the Act that I've talked about today, ways for employees to download our complaint form. Here's how you can download our poster by clicking on this download here. You can also order a printed copy of it. It has links to all of the OSHA standards that we've adopted or incorporated by reference, links to the Ohio Revised Code, the Ohio Administrative Code chapters that include the information about PERRP. Our top 25 recognized hazards by section and by standard, and then there's also a version of this presentation, a slightly longer version in a PDF format right here on the web page. So we've got different tabs at the top that you can navigate through. Compliance Assistance Services is under the Services tab. We've got a record keeping tab that explains the importance of injury and illness record keeping, a tab for our employee rights section that talks about, again, how to file complaints, what the complaint process is all about, and then some resources for you. So we've got links again to the standards, a little bit more information about our common violations. Over here on the right, we're going to be adding fatal facts. We have safety alerts. Here's another place to download a copy of the PERRP poster, the complaint form, and then some record-keeping resources. We have Excel spreadsheet versions of our record-keeping forms and also the instruction book, and a presentation that you can peruse that has that goes over the record-keeping requirements. And I think that's about all that I wanted to touch on today, and we're almost out of time. I wanted to provide plenty of time for questions.
Does anyone have any questions? You can either put them in the question box, or if you raise your hand, I could probably call you that way too. I know some people. Let me see if I can. Hold on one second. Let me lower attendees' hands, and I can see if anyone has any questions. Okay, so you can either raise your hand on there and I can unmute you, or you can type in a question. Hold on 1 second. Michael Benson has a question. Michael, you should be unmuted. No, that's working. Somebody asked, back to the grant, do we need to send in a SIG application along with the firefighter equipment grant?
If you're applying for the SIG program, you apply, actually that's a different application, different process. With the SIG grant, you apply online. The application's actually submitted online. But those are two separate programs and two different grants, so I'm not too sure why they would both be submitted at the same time.
Okay. And then what section of the Ohio Revised Code placed firefighters into the PERRP?
Well, it's in Chapter 4167. 4167.01 is where the definitions are, and that's where the change occurred. The online version of the revised code hasn't been updated yet. I would anticipate that it's going to be happening pretty soon here. But the definitions were changed on July 1st when the governor signed the BWC budget bill. That will be where you'll be able to see that. So as part of House Bill 27, if you want to look up House Bill 27 that was signed into law on June 30th.
And then what is the deadline for the FEEEG grant?
Oh, for the firefighter grant, there is not a deadline. Funds are the grant applications are being accepted as long as funds are available.
Okay, and just verifying that if 3 or more firefighters get hurt at a fire and go to the hospital, we're required to report the fact in 8 hours?
That's correct if they're hospitalized, not just going. They have to actually be admitted, inpatient.
Any other questions? I don't see anything else. Well, thank you so much for joining the webinar today, and I will get copies of the presentations and make them available, and we did record the webinar, so that will be available as well, and we'll make sure to get the information out to everybody. And I can send the information out about the ORC changes from the workers' comp bill. I'm happy to send that out to everybody. Oh, there's one more question. Hold on 1 second. Okay, hold on. I may have missed this, but the specific safety regulations for firefighting in the Ohio Administrative Code are going to be part of PERRP. That makes sense.
No, that's a whole different process. That's called the VSSR rules, or the Violation of Specific Safety Regulations. Those rules apply to workers' comp claims, so those are not going to be part of the PERRP rules. That's part of the claims process. And they only apply if an employee or an employee's family files a workers' compensation claim and they allege that the employer has not complied with one of those rules. So I guess the short answer is no.
Okay, and then one more question. How many hoods can we request, 1 per person or more?
That question's come up recently, and I'm checking into this. I will have a response for that next week. So hopefully I'll be able to share that with you, Michelle, and we can get that information out.
That'd be great. We'd be happy to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Again, thank you so much. We really appreciate it, and we'll, send the relevant information out. And I know there are some other opportunities coming up. I think you guys are having some in-person meetings at the Fire Academy in the next week or so to address additional questions that people have. But we'll stay in communication, and if anybody has any specific questions, let us know, and we'll work on getting those answered. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.